So it's now my time to introduce Dr. James Galloway, who is the Sidman P. Poole Professor at the University of Virginia in the Department of Environmental Sciences. And Jim was specifically recognized by the Tyler Prize Executive Committee for his quantitative characterization and detailing of biochemical cycles, the multiple impacts of human inputs to them, and the consequences for the global environment, particularly as illustrated by his development of the nitrogen cascade. So Jim's presentation is entitled, indeed, Nitrogen Cascading Through Our Lives.
Linda, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and I am well prepared. I have my notes, and I have my wife's watch. Nancy, thank you very much. And of course, I can't wear my glasses because they don't see this distance, so I have no idea what time it is, but I understand I have an hour. Is that right? And I have my note also, not to mention the fact that University of Virginia is going to beat USC on August 30 with the football game. Thank you very much. Any questions? Those of you who are English majors will recognize this quote from Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, water, water everywhere, how the board should shrink, etc. Of course, sailors dying of thirst, surrounded by water, the wrong kind of water. Here we have a case with nitrogen. All living species are surrounded by nitrogen. It's the wrong kind of nitrogen. It's the molecule N2. We can't use it. We desperately need it. I have some definitions for you. Unreactive nitrogen, that stuff that we can't use, is not biologically or chemically or physically active, is N2. All the other nitrogen species are referred to as reactive nitrogen. And it's either biologically, chemically, or physically, like it absorbs radiation. We all require nitrogen, all living forms. Of the greater than 10 million species, biological species on the surface of the Earth, less than 1,000 have this ability to take N2 and convert it to reactive nitrogen. So we're, in some ways, held hostage to these very few species. And so it's not surprising that nitrogen is limiting to most ecosystems, and certainly most in the temperate world. I'm going to talk with you for 4 things: the eras of nitrogen, how reactive nitrogens form, what role people have in this, the nitrogen cascade, of course, and then what can we do about it at the local, individual, the national, and international scale. Once upon a time, we relied on natural ecosystems, natural nitrogen capital in ecosystems, to extract the nitrogen from the soil, to put it into grains, and to put it into animals using animal and human labor. Once upon a time, we relied on cellulose to make protein on the hoof. And then once upon a time, we relied on modern fuels, modern biofuels, to provide energy. Now, Doug earlier today said he hoped that I would have the opportunity to show this. Of course, you all know what this is. You note the broad forehead, the prominent nose. This is, of course, the belted Galloway. It's a very handsome animal. So, moving on. Era 1, the beginning of time, the beginning of life, to about 1898. People relied, all systems relied on this natural nitrogen capital, the natural amounts of reactive nitrogen in the environment, until this guy, president of the British Association for the Advancement of Science in 1898, said, the world is running out of nitrogen to feed people. There wasn't enough nitrogen available in natural capital to provide wheat and other foodstuffs for people. And he challenged the chemists, and he challenged the engineers to come up with a way to take N2 out of the atmosphere and convert it to ammonia to grow food. Hence, Era 2, 1898 to 2008, Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch developed the Haber-Bosch cycle process, where you can take N2 and hydrogen and make ammonia. And so we today are using that to make lots of reactive nitrogen. We're also growing more soybeans and other legumes to make lots of reactive nitrogen. We're doing that on purpose to feed people. We also create reactive nitrogen by accident as a pollutant when we burn fossil fuels. An interesting side note about Haber and Bosch, of course, that when they developed this process in 1910 to 1914, they didn't do it to feed people. They did it to provide munitions to Germany for World War I because Germany was blockaded during the First World War. So we have in Era 2 now the new way of making grain, and that is monocultures, agroecosystems. The new way of making meat, instead of a cow, handsome though it is, grazing on grass to make a protein, you have feedlots. And note, this is taken in near Colorado. Note the mountains in the background. And here you have energy production, fossil fuel combustion, as opposed to modern biomass combustion. All these processes, these two processes rely on fertilizer production, creating reactive nitrogen, and this process again creates reactive nitrogen by accident. Over the last 150 years or so, we have now, this is the population of the world. On this axis, we have the creation of reactive nitrogen. The unit is teragrams, and a teragram is essentially 1,000,000 metric tons. Okay, so just think 1,000,000 tons when you see this scale. Energy production creates reactive nitrogen by accident, not much compared to the total. It's mostly food production. We mostly create reactive nitrogen on purpose to make food to feed people. Remember, 160 teragrams, 160 million tons of reactive nitrogen created each year by people to feed people. Just so you don't forget it, here it is real big. And so we're using that 160 teragrams to feed 6.5 billion people. But there's some other kind of news. Each person each year only needs 2 kilograms of nitrogen. And so if you do, this is high math for me, if you do math, if you multiply 2 kilograms times 6.5 billion people, you get this really small number, 13 teragrams of nitrogen. That's all that people, all the reactive nitrogen we need to make to feed people. But we make 160. Why? And what's the consequence of this? The why and the consequence is embodied in this slide. Here we have N2. Fertilizer production and cultivation-induced biological nitrogen fixation converts that N2 into fertilizer used to grow grain, the grain used to feed animals. This food in this black box is then, some of it's taken up by people. And this is from a book, The Food We Eat. And then, of course, what the nitrogen that people consume to sustain themselves is lost to the environment in the form of human waste. But only about 10 to 14% of the reactive nitrogen that comes into this box ever enters a human mouth. Most of it goes into the environment because the incorporation of nitrogen into crops and into animals is very inefficient. It's lost during the nitrogen to crop uptake. It's lost during getting the grains out of crops. It's lost during trying to feed animals to get the nitrogen in animals. The loss is manure. And so most of this reactive nitrogen is lost directly to the environment. Air emissions, water emissions, accumulation in soils. And of course, energy production creates reactive nitrogen. That just is directly injected into the atmosphere. Now, keep an eye on this green box because it's now going to shift to the left. And we now have all this reactive nitrogen created by humans for the express purpose of making food that's then injected to the environment. What happens to it? Well, you have a contribution to ozone and small particle formation in the atmosphere. You have forest dieback due to nitrogen saturation in forest soils. Note that about 40% of all the reactive nitrogen created by people is emitted to the atmosphere, and you have widespread atmospheric dispersion of this nitrogen. You have acidification of high-altitude lakes and streams, and of course losses of biodiversity in each of these. You have eutrophication. Remember, think about the dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico and dead zones around the world where you have too many nutrients causing harmful algal blooms, loss of oxygen, hypoxia, and anoxia, and then, of course, loss of biodiversity. You have global warming. Here are these little tiny polar bears about to fall into the water. And then, of course, you have stratospheric ozone depletion. The nitrogen cascade is that one atom of nitrogen put in the environment can contribute to each of these impacts. First, the nitrogen's in the atmosphere. Then it's deposited to forest systems. Then it's leaked to surface waters. Then it goes to the coast. And then, through the processes of nitrification and denitrification, some of it is emitted as nitrous oxide to the atmosphere, or greenhouse gas, which contributes to global warming. And then, after a while, it diffuses into the stratosphere, contributing to stratospheric ozone depletion. And so the cascade is that once you fix a molecule of nitrogen, convert N2 to reactive nitrogen, realizing that most of this is lost to the environment, it cascades through environmental systems, causing impacts to people and ecosystems as it moves through. And the challenge is, how do you get that reactive nitrogen back to N2? It's a major challenge facing society, because each year more and more reactive nitrogen is created, and each year more and more is accumulating in our environmental ecosystems. So, the third era, 2008 onward. This is a picture of our lunch that we just had. Thanks to Doug for taking it. And so how in this third era do we optimize these benefits and minimize the problems associated with too much reactive nitrogen in the environment? There are a variety of things we can do. These boxes are colored red. Control fossil fuel combustion. This reactive nitrogen is created by accident. It's a pollutant. We don't need it. We have the technology. We have the science. We have the engineering to make this a very small number. What's required is the political will. It's a challenge enough to have the political will in this country. But most of this reactive nitrogen in the future formed by combustion is not going to happen in this country. It's going to happen in Asia. And so this country has a very bad history of imposing its political will on other countries. The environment is no different. The second, increased nitrogen uptake efficiencies in crops and animals. We can be more clever in putting nitrogen into crops, more clever in putting nitrogen into animals. And so then the greater the degree to which we're able to do that means that we need less reactive nitrogen created for the purposes of fertilizers. We can manage manure. So look closely at this slide. That's not the Rocky Mountains. That's piles of manure on fire. Okay? Taken in Nebraska, the fire took months to put out. So this is a resource that can be used to grow food. And to the degree that we can do that, requires less reactive nitrogen to be created. Because, again, the key is if we can decrease this number, the amount of N2 converted to reactive nitrogen, that means that less is going to get into the environment. Improve sewage treatment, reactive nitrogen. Everything we eat ends up in the environment. Okay, we accumulate very little reactive nitrogen in our human bodies. Very small percentage of the sewage is treated in the tertiary treatment, which will convert reactive nitrogen to the molecule N2. Of course, we have the technology, we have the science, we have the engineering to create tertiary treatment plants. So let's say we do all this stuff, especially 1, 2, and 4. What does this do to this 160 plus the amount from combustion, this 187 teragrams of reactive nitrogen we create in the environment? Well, currently, this is how much is lost to the environment each year. So much we create, and realizing that it's all lost to the environment, that 187. Well, if we do those 4 things, we have crop management, sewage management, fossil fuel controls, animal management. So we've taken care of about 53 teragrams. But we still got a lot to go. We still have all this other material that we have, reactive nitrogen, that we need to figure out how to control. So the term carbon footprint you're probably familiar with. The term ecological footprint you're probably familiar with. And if you do a Google search, every now and then you'll find something on the nitrogen footprint. But it's having to do with very special systems, wheat perhaps, or the nitrogen footprint of a pig, which is an interesting concept. We can look to see, however, that we'd have a nitrogen footprint if you took it in broad scale, broad brush. Every year in North America, we create 100 kilograms per person of reactive nitrogen. So collectively, for people in North America, that's our footprint. That's what our lifestyle is resulting in creation. Of course, areas with a lower standard of living have smaller footprints on a per capita per year basis, and some areas have a very small, remembering that each human being needs 2 kilograms of nitrogen per person per year for survival. And so one of the things that I hope to do with the Tyler Price funds and also with the attention given to it is to develop this integrated nitrogen footprint for scientists and society and policymakers especially to use to get this big picture on how we can manage nitrogen in the environment. There are solutions at many scales to deal with this other 134 teragrams. We can produce food with less nitrogen loss to the environment. We can produce energy with essentially no reactive nitrogen loss to the environment. We ourselves can have an impact through energy consumption, through food consumption. We don't need energy consumption from fossil fuels or energy produced by fossil fuels, and we don't need to consume food that's been transported long distances and had a very large nitrogen footprint associated with that food. At the national level, there needs to be special attention. We have laws for air pollution, water pollution, solid waste pollution, but nitrogen, because of the Cascade, you have to integrate those regulatory approaches to be effective at controlling nitrogen. And of course, because the nitrogen issues are global, not just from the atmospheric transport that I talked about, but also a project that Hal Mooney and I have worked on with his colleagues at Stanford and FAO in looking at nitrogen that's embedded in commodities that are shipped around the world. And indeed, commodity transport of nitrogen, fertilizer, grains, and meat, is now one of the largest ways of getting nitrogen from one continent to another. And one of the things that I've been working on is the International Nitrogen Initiative, formed in 2003, sponsored by SCOPE and the International Biosphere Program that Hal was instrumental in forming, and trying to not just look at the biogeochemical aspects of nitrogen, but also engaging policymakers, because it's really the challenge to the scientists to put their language into words that others can understand to formulate changes in policy at the local, national, and international level. There is one other aspect. This is the first slide I showed you. Lots of water, but it's salt. Not enough kind of water. They need fresh water. Lots of nitrogen, the wrong kind. Not enough of the right type. And so the flip side is that in addition to problems with too much nitrogen in the environment due to the Cascade, there are large regions of the world where there's not enough nitrogen, resulting in starvation, poverty, and it's being exacerbated now by things like biofuels, because there's such a demand for using food for energy production instead of to sustain people, that lands that were once used to provide, lands in this country that were once used to provide corn for the people, are now being used to grow corn to sell on the open market to fuel the industrialized world's need for fuels. So, these are my concluding remarks. You can read those as well as I can. I'm quite optimistic about how society being able to get its handle on how to provide to enable that we get the benefits of converting N2 to reactive nitrogen while minimizing the problems. And I thank you very much for your attention.